Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Speaking of Resilience podcast. I'm your host, Kate Madigan with the Michigan Climate Action Network. Today's guest is Dr. Brandy Brown. Brandy leads the Office of Climate and Energy within the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, or EGLE. This office was created by Governor Whitmer to lead the state's work to achieve aggressive climate action goals.
The governor has been clear. She wants us to get out front and lead. And so all of those things are things that we're trying to figure out with partners around the state to get done. We've been mindful about not just coming out with a blanket policy that we're not able to live up to our promises on, right? So we've looked at where are we as Michigan emitting greenhouse gases? Where are the barriers to hitting our climate goals? And we have been honing in on those emitters to figure out, okay, how can we help you lead us as we move into a cleaner future? We want to make sure that we're bringing everybody along with us. As we move forward with climate, we know it's going to take huge investments. We need to make sure that the entire system is benefiting everyone.
Brandy is an experienced energy strategist with deep industry knowledge after working for several years designing energy programs with utilities and businesses. I've had the opportunity to work with Brandy over the past year, and I really enjoyed talking with her today, especially talking with her about the governor's continued commitment to make Michigan a climate leader and how the COVID crisis has elevated the urgent need to address environmental and racial justice, including in our work to address the climate crisis. So here's our interview with Brandy Brown. Well, welcome, Dr. Brandy Brown. It is really a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for taking the time to join our podcast.
Thanks, Kate, for this opportunity. I'm excited to be here, my first podcast.
All right. So I heard you speak at the Drawdown Conference last year in Grand Rapids, and there, as part of your keynote, you told some of your story and what brought you to this work and why you're passionate about climate and justice. And will you share some of that story with us now?
Certainly. Well, I was born and raised in Kalamazoo, Michigan, part of a very large family, many cousins. I'm related to, I think, almost half of Kalamazoo County. But as part of that family history, we talk a lot about genealogy. We talk a lot about the stories and the trials that we traversed to get here to this point, to reach the point where we are today. And so as part of those stories, we talk about the land and the water a lot. So we have images in our mind of what the land was like where we lived in North Carolina and Virginia 200 years ago, and that trial of coming to Michigan through Indiana. And all of those stories will have personalities of my ancestors, as well as the swampy lands that they lived in, or the hill they lived on, and what the trees looked like and what the river looked like. So that is certainly a part of who I am. And when I began work in energy and climate, I really was struck by the thread that is woven in all of those stories. So when my grandfather told me about his father, long time ago, and how large the old growth trees were here in Michigan when they came here to what we see around us today, or the river, the Kalamazoo River, and how stinky it was when my father was a child, and it was notorious for that, to now where when I was growing up, it was kind of stinky sometimes where we lived in Kalamazoo, but not too bad. But now there's this legacy of tar sands oil in the water and the riverbeds behind my children's school. So I feel like that's a thread that is deeply woven with my family and with my connection to them and the land around us. So that is one piece of the pie. The other piece is that I had the opportunity to begin in the energy industry as an external evaluator way back when. And that gave me a new, fresh look at a field I was not familiar with, but understanding essentially how it works and how environmental programs are measured and how they're weighted and what's included and how we value those things and what's not. And so after working in the energy industry, specifically on strategically building up electrification around North America, I came to this position with this broad understanding of not only my personal values, but also the really boring technical things that nobody wants to know. I've at times kind of jumped headfirst into that and have a pretty good understanding, or at least tried to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a really great combination. The head and the heart. Um, what is it like in state government right now? I mean, given that we're in the middle of the COVID crisis and the administration has been the priority for
Yeah.
several months, can you give us an idea what it's like behind the scenes?
Well, I want to share first what it was like when I first entered government. I think it's a lot of what I imagine. I do have to share that my father was a state of Michigan employee for 35 years, so I did have a bit of familiarity with state government from that perspective. But entering in, it's what you imagine a state government to be. There are systems in place. There's tons of people with a lot of in-depth knowledge. That what amazed me was the congeniality and meeting all of my new colleagues. That was great. And so it was this very dedicated, warm environment to walk into. And how that's shifted since the time of COVID is, I see that dedication dialed up a million times. Folks coming from all angles, no matter what role they have, to jump into the current problems that we need to work through. And so, you'll see some of the IT folks have jumped in on the UIA team to make sure that process is good for Michiganders. And there's a lot of increased work. There's a lot of energy. There's I want to say there is a huge passion that I really feel, and everyone feeling like, we need to make sure we do the best job possible for Michigan residents. So I'm proud of that and watching that, and I am just I get jazzed up every time I log on from my computer down here in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and I see all of my other colleagues just hammering away at things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the COVID crisis also has really laid bare a lot of the environmental and racial injustices that are also at the heart of the climate crisis. You and I have talked about this some before. Will you talk about that and some of the parallels you see to the climate crisis?
Well, certainly, the environmental justice issues that we see across the world, across the nation, specifically here in Michigan, are not new. Folks have been screaming from the rooftops about these issues and saying that the way in which we use energy, the way in which we use our live our lives or use products or consume is and can have a negative effect on the communities around us. And it disproportionately impacts Black and Brown communities for the reasons of the ways we've built this society. So there are environmental justice warriors who are sounding that alarm constantly, and they've been saying that for as long as I can remember. I remember hearing stories about how communities here in Michigan had to live with some of the outputs of the mills, and they love the mills because that's where they worked. But on the same token, there were some impacts there for folks' health. So I remember those stories, and the parallels are clear, and that what we're seeing in COVID is it's laying bare all of these things in real time. It's almost like a sped up time-lapse video of the public health impacts that we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. And it's scary, it's painful to see. I remember when COVID was rolling out and we were seeing some of the research going out, and knowing what we know about the communities in Michigan, we were fearful of what was going to happen. And then to see some of those impacts come about, it is frustrating. It brings up a lot of anger. So you asked about parallels, and I think that the parallels between what we're seeing in environmental justice and climate are that, those alarms have been sounding. They are urgent alarms, and we need to have more action, period. There's no excuse to not act on either issue.
Yeah. Thank you. Um, Governor Whitmer created your position and created the Office of Climate and Energy pretty much in her about a month into her time in office. And so for climate activists, this was an encouraging sign that the governor was making the climate crisis a priority. And then Eagle Director Lisa Clark spoke at our first Michigan Climate Action Summit and said the governor was all in on climate. And the governor herself was scheduled to speak at this year's climate summit that we had to cancel at the very last minute. It was supposed to be March 12th because of the COVID crisis. So at this point, we've heard a lot of talk and a lot, but not a lot of big action yet on climate. We understand why the COVID crisis is the top priority right now. And I really appreciate how well the governor has led Michigan through that. In fact, I see she's featured in Rolling Stone because she's done such a great job. But this is a climate podcast, so I want to ask you about, what can you tell us about what the governor is planning to do, the actions she's planning to take on climate change, and when that might be?
The action on climate change is what I think it's huge. I think it's what Michigan needs, and the groundwork has been laid for us to do so many huge things. I do want to say that because we had to delay any announcement, that doesn't mean that work has stopped on any of those items of figuring out what climate action should look like in Michigan and what we can do together. We are still thinking that through, but it's through a different lens right now. It's through the lens of how we can directly impact Michiganders to help in an important way. So it's the public health lens, it's the supporting communities and revitalization. This is a really hard time for a lot of people. So we are going to keep moving down that path, but it is that pivot of being aware of what folks need right now and what we're able to bite off. We still think we can bite off climate action, but I think it is an opportunity for us to make sure that just transition is at the front, to make sure that environmental justice is at the front. So we have been pivoting, not so much, I think, just making sure that those items are prioritized in a way to make sure that they're getting the funding and the direction and the support that they need to flourish later. So I would anticipate an action on climate as soon as Michigan is ready to take that step. But if there is nothing done with a big hurrah, I don't want folks to think that we're not still charging ahead.
Okay. You mentioned, switching gears a little bit to talk about Line 5, you mentioned, still seeing the impacts of tar sands in the community where you grew up, where you live, Kalamazoo. And we recently interviewed Brian Newland, chairman of the Bay Mills Indian community. We talked a lot about Line 5. And Enbridge is moving forward with permitting to try to build the Line 5 oil tunnel right now, even during the shutdown and the state of emergency.
Yeah.
Building new oil infrastructure in the middle of, when climate scientists are urging us to move away from fossil fuels this decade, there's a disconnect there. So as the top climate advisor to Governor Whitmer, what's your thinking? What's your position on Line 5?
Well, unfortunately, I'm unable to fully address that question right now, just because that permitting process is before Eagle, and as a member of Eagle, I'm unable to dive in on that. But what I will say is that, I'll ask folks to look at the UP Energy Task Force and the work that's been done there and going to be done there, and understand, how the system is built, and look at some of the reports that have been shared. There's some really good information about how energy, and specifically fossil fuels, are used in the UP. And so I think that's a good primer for anyone understanding the wider energy transition that we're undergoing right now. I think folks understand that things are changing, that this is the next industrial revolution, right? So things are changing and we have to look at everything with new eyes and a new way. And I invite everyone to keep the discussion going.
Mm-hmm.
So sorry for curving on that, that question.
Well, you talked about the UP Energy Task Force, which was, the governor created this, and the first year, the task force, which you are a big leader on the task force, you and the Eagle director, and a lot of senior staff within the administration were traveling to the Upper Peninsula when we were traveling, and now are still meeting regularly. Which I think shows a lot of commitment from and a lot of resources focused on the UP. The first year was on the propane report.
Right.
And I was really pleased to see that the results of that report were that there are reasonable alternatives to get propane to the UP if Line 5 were to be decommissioned.
Yeah. And I think the broader scope of that was outside of a decommissioning, right? It was any disruption, because we saw in the winters of 2013, 2014, that there were huge price spikes that hindered families' ability in the UP to heat their homes through propane. So it was looking at what happens if this system, for some reason, does not have the redundancy for folks to heat their homes. What happens if there's another emergency? And yes, it did answer that question as to whether or not there were alternative supply mechanisms for folks up there for propane. So it's very enlightening. And I was pleased with what we uncovered, but I have to tell you, when we're talking about alternatives and looking at how the system up there is built and what the opportunities are to really invest in a resilient system for folks in the UP, but also learning from that for the rest of the state, that's huge. And I think that's the conversation where minds will really start to have a good time. So I'm looking forward to having that alternatives discussion, reimagining what it can look like in the future, and then deciding how we build to get there.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because the focus this year going forward, which the meetings you've already started, is looking broadly at what the energy future looks like in the UP, and reliability and affordability and renewable energy. Those are all parts of the puzzle. So
yeah, those are key. And it's the part of the broader conversation that's going worldwide, as we see that renewables are much more cost effective than fossil fuels, and also have those health benefits of going green that fossil fuels may not have with the emissions that they output. So one of the things that we really want to do is make sure that we're accurately measuring those impacts on health of fossil fuels, so that when we are looking at the business case, that we understand what that true ROI is.
Support for this episode of the Speaking of Resilience podcast is provided by Desmond Liggett Wealth Advisors, where Matt Desmond and Zach Liggett work closely with clients to thoughtfully and confidently navigate today's unprecedented challenges. Locally owned and strictly fee only, Desmond Liggett emphasizes comprehensive financial planning and responsible, proactive investment strategies built to meet near-term needs and to attain long-term goals. If you are seeking impact and resilience in your financial life, the team at Desmond Liggett would love to chat. Learn more at desmondliggett.com.
I know you've been doing a lot of research into Michigan's greenhouse gas emissions in all areas beyond electricity and transportation and heating and all sectors. And we interviewed recently Dr. Missy Stoltz from Ann Arbor, and they just set a goal and completed a plan to be carbon neutral by 2030. What are some strategies from your research that you think that could be applied to Michigan to make Michigan a leader?
Of course. Yeah. So there are a few different strategies, but I will say first that investing heavily into energy efficiency is one of the most clear and cost-effective ways of not only reducing energy consumption, reducing energy burden on households, but it is also a clear way to reduce emissions. And so researchers have shown that we can reach about 40% of our emissions reduction target through energy efficiency. That is massive. And that if we are working in that direction, then it does give us time to develop technologies, to find alternative solutions, to maybe change our behavior so that we are not emitting so much greenhouse gas in the first place. So I'm a really big proponent of energy efficiency. I've come from that world a little bit, and I've seen it do wonders, and there is a huge gap in who we're serving with those energy efficiency dollars in our program. So if we looked at the potential for that, we could serve a lot of lower and moderate income folks just by weatherizing homes to make sure that everyone's home is secure. And that would actually save us all money on grid investments.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And I mentioned Ann Arbor and other cities. There are a lot of cities around the country and in Michigan now that have set 100% renewable energy goals. Now there are 12 states with ambitious 100% renewable energy goals.
Mm-hmm.
Is Michigan still looking at being among the leading states? Now that we're in the middle of this COVID crisis and a lot has changed, are we still looking at being a leader on climate in the country?
The governor has been clear. She wants us to get out front and lead. And so all of those things are things that we're trying to figure out with partners around the state to get done. We've been mindful about not just coming out with a blanket policy that we're not able to live up to our promises on, right? So we've looked at where are we as Michigan emitting greenhouse gases? Where are the barriers to hitting our climate goals? And we have been honing in on those sectors and those emitters to figure out, okay, how can we help you lead us as we move forward into this transition? Because as we move down here into a cleaner, as we move into a cleaner future, we want to make sure that we're bringing everybody along with us. One of the things I'm mindful of, and this kind of goes back to environmental justice, is that past investments in society don't always benefit everyone the same. And so we cannot do that as we move forward with climate. We know it's going to take huge investments, and we want to make sure that it's not just certain families who can afford to benefit that from those dollars and have matched investment. We need to make sure that the entire system is benefiting everyone. So that is where we're going, but the governor is clear. We're going to lead on climate.
Okay, that's reassuring to hear. Yeah, that's great. Transportation is another, we talk a lot about electrification, we talk a lot about electricity, our electricity sector, and moving off of coal but transportation now is the largest source of climate emissions in Michigan. We're the car capital of the world. Can you tell us about the state's plans to advance electric vehicles in our state, and also to, other transportation plans like mass transit and walkability?
Yeah, well, a lot of those are still in the works. It is a big apple to bite out of, and we are going about it pretty much methodically and figuring out where the industry is now, where do we need to be to make sure that all Michiganders are able to bridge this transition to electrified transportation, where our industry is there, and bringing everybody along at once. So there is a concerted effort to make sure that happens. I think there's, anytime we're talking about electrifying transportation, you're right, is the leading cause of emissions in Michigan and most other places now that coal is being reduced as a fossil fuel. So the difficulty there is we need to kind of crack into human behavior on that. You know, a lot of us use our cars quite frequently down here in Southwest Michigan. We like our trucks, we like them big. And so there's some behavior stuff that we really have to look deep within and figure out, does this really fit with the world we want to leave? Does this really fit with how we want to impact the earth and impact the health of ourselves and our neighbors? So that is a bigger question. The other thing comes into planning. So we're at a pivotal time in our society. We have to invest, right? Infrastructure was built quite a while ago. We need to invest in infrastructure. So if we're going to invest in infrastructure and think about how we live, work, and play, we need to think about how mobility plays into that. Are we going to be commuting for hours? Does that seem like something that's a piece of a resilient community? Is that the way we want to live our lives? And I think this forced pause that we're all under with COVID is helping many of us rethink how we live our lives and what we really accept. So what I'm hoping also to see is that now that we've demonstrated how productive we can be remotely, that maybe we can do some more of that. I have to tell you, I live not too far from I-94, and my skies have never been bluer. The last time I remember the skies being this blue here is when I was a child, maybe 30 years ago. So I think about it every day, and I don't know that we need to go back to where we were, and that will be a huge factor in our mobility future.
Mm-hmm. Great. I wanted to ask you a little more specifically about, you talked about when we were talking about what the governor's planning to do on climate change.
Yeah.
And you mentioned investing more in communities. It sounded like community resiliency, so that communities can be more resilient to the climate impacts, which I think is a really important place to pivot right now, because it's becoming so clear. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, or are you good? Leave it at where we left it.
Yeah, I can. It's still, we are still working through and figuring out where we can push and what we can get done the fastest. So if you imagine like a whack-a-mole type thing, that's what we're doing. Can we go here? Can we go there? So as far as investing in communities, it's got to be multifaceted. We need to one, make sure our residents are safe and secure. And a lot goes into safety and security. So are their homes safe? Is the air quality in their homes safe? Are they able to be warm? Are they able to have broadband internet access? A lot of folks don't think that has a lot to do with climate, but as we're seeing now, if we can almost zero out our transportation emissions from staying home, it has a lot to do there. So investing in housing infrastructure is key on my list. Also, investing in some of the planning so that we already know which parts of Michigan are going to be heavily impacted by climate. We've seen the impacts of high water levels and increased precipitation already, and how that has devastated communities. And so if there is anything we can do to identify those places early and make sure that they have the investments to get through that. So if they are building up, they're building able to do it better and stronger to overcome the increased frequencies of storms or heat that they may incur. So it's really going back to that human experience and making sure that each community is able to weather this.
Yeah. And we're really seeing how climate change is a threat multiplier, I guess, to use military terms right now. I mean, because we're in the middle of this COVID crisis. People are dying. People are struggling enormously to just put food on the table. And then we have, severe flooding in Detroit and in Midland and in northern Michigan, all over the state, kind of all at the same time. So it's just, It is,
after researching it for so long and knowing what scientists have been warning us about for decades, and seeing it happen, it's a different feeling, and it's scary. And so us coming together and standing up all at once and saying, hey, climate is not a political issue, but it is something that if we're going to make it through this together, that we need to consider, because it will change the shape of everything we do. And I want to see us successful in this. I want all of our communities to thrive, as does the governor. And so it really does come back to making sure that we're not only leading in our actions, but that our results are so impactful that in 20 years we can say, yes, Michigan did all the things that they needed to do for people to not only live in resilient communities, but to have stable health outcomes, to be able to alleviate some of the burdens that we're seeing now.
I also want to ask you about the justice and the opportunity for climate justice, to really center that, because, we would talk about it before the COVID crisis. I think it just made it so clear, the injustices that we're seeing, and the environmental justice and the access to healthcare, and the in Black communities and communities of color, and how there's Harvard studies, there are studies that show clearly that communities of color, Black communities and individuals are impacted much more greatly by the COVID crisis, are dying at higher rates. I think it's just entered our understanding in Michigan, in the US, so much more so than before. Are you seeing that as well? And do you think that there's opportunities for more rapid change?
I think there's certainly always an opportunity for more rapid change. As I referenced earlier, I think this is like a scary movie sped up, where we're seeing the impacts that folks have been saying, hey, I'm developing this respiratory illness because of these particulate emissions that I'm exposed to, because those diseases take so much time. There was room for people to say, well, maybe it wasn't that, maybe there was something else in your environment. And unfortunately, here in this country, we often blame the individual. And so, well, maybe there's something in your personal life that is responsible for you having this outcome. And now with COVID, having that link to morbidity, the morbidity of COVID and particulate emissions, it really just hammers it home. And what I hope is that people can no longer excuse what we've been seeing in our communities. And I'm saying this as a Black Indigenous woman. We see this in our communities all the time. And when folks go for help and they say, hey, we're experiencing this, hey, we've had a cluster of health issues, what they get back is typically, we want more research, we need to collect data, we need to validate your experience, because we can't quite believe what you're saying. And it is hurtful and it's harmful. So one of the things I hope that comes out of this is, as we look at our procedures in any organization we're in, right? As we look at our procedures and how we set to remedy some of this inequality, that we really look at ourselves, we look at, the judgments we're making, we try to figure out, are we sending these programs to the right area? If they're to the right area, are they getting to the right people? And then hold ourselves accountable. Because what often happens is we develop a solution, but that solution never makes it to the folks who need it, or it's not the right solution. So what folks are asking for, sometimes we say, oh, that's too big, that's too much to give you. And so what I hope happens with this conversation is that we listen to those voices, know they're valid without questioning them, and then give them what they need, give them what they're asking. Don't have outsiders come in, don't have me come in and you say what a particular community needs. Go to that community, hear their experiences, believe their experiences, and do whatever is in your power to help them.
Great. Any last words, anything else that you'd like to talk about that we haven't touched on today?
I just want to say, it's a time of transition right now, and it's important for all of us to be as fully engaged as possible to really dive in, however we can, to lend a hand to our neighbors and our friends, strangers, to just make sure we all get through this. Climate is a big lift, as is environmental justice, and we're not going to get there doing everything as we have been. But I certainly appreciate all the advocates out there, all the agitators out there. I just want to say, keep doing what you're doing. If there are things that you see us in the administration not moving on climate, please reach out, let me know, tweet me and tell me, hey, you're messing up on this. We appreciate that. And we want to have that relationship to make sure that we are being responsive to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate. This was awesome. And I'm not as scared to do a podcast now.
Oh, good.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Speaking of Resilience podcast, supported by our friends at Desmond Liggett Wealth Advisors. You can find more episodes of the Speaking of Resilience podcast on our website, groundworkcenter.org/podcast, and on all major podcast platforms. If you appreciate this content, become a podcast supporter by donating at groundworkcenter.org/podcast, and we'll give you a shout out in our next episode. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast wherever you listen in, subscribe to our newsletter, and follow us on Facebook at Groundwork Center and at Michigan Climate Action Network. Speaking of Resilience is created by the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities and the Michigan Climate Action Network. This episode was produced by Miriam, Owsley, and Jeff Smith, hosted by Kate Madigan.